Video we're going to show you how to install a crankshaft. And in order to do that, we first have washed the block and washed the crankshaft thoroughly. We've cleaned out all of the oil gallery holes, and we've prepped the block for assembly. So we've done quite a bit to get ready for this. But the first step is to clean off these bearing cap surfaces. So we've wiped these with a rag and then installed the upper bearing halves. And when you do this, you have to make sure that the holes in the bearings align with the holes in the engine block. You'll see the hole, the oil gallery there. And you'll notice that he's taking care not to touch the inside of the bearing with his fingers. And make sure the alignment tab, if you notice there's a little tab on each of these bearings. Just make sure those line up. There's one on each side. So the bearing's put in correctly. And then we need to make sure the thrust bearing is in there. In this case, this has a separate pieces for the thrust bearing. And we're going to put some petroleum jelly on the back side of that thrust bearing just to help hold it in place while we install the crankshaft. There's another piece here. So you've got that thrust bearing installed, and on some engines it's just a one-piece thrust bearing. Now we want to get some assembly lube and put it on those bearings. And we don't want to touch the bearing surfaces with our fingers, especially if our fingers are dirty. But we'll put some assembly lube on there, and then with clean hands we'll try to carefully spread the assembly lube across the bearing surface. We'll do that to each of the bearings. And you'll notice that in this case the bearing on the end is different than the rest of them too. So you'll just have to make sure that you put the right bearings in the right place and they're all in the right direction. Again, noting the alignment tabs on the end. To apply assembly lube to the surfaces of your thrust bearing as well, both sides. This is a different engine, but on this one, the rear main seal fits into this groove right here, and the rear main seal needs to be installed. It's a two-piece rear main seal. It needs to be installed right now before the crankshaft goes in. On most crankshafts now, though, the rear main seal is a one-piece round seal, and that one can be installed later. You don't need to worry about that. But if you have this groove for a rear main seal, make sure and get your rear main seal out. It consists of two halves like this. And it'll go into that groove, but there's a right way and a wrong way. If you look at the lip on this seal needs to face the engine. So you can see that groove, that lip. That groove right there needs to face toward the engine so that it catches the oil. If I flip it around and put it in backwards, it'll leak. So the correct way is with this groove. That groove right there facing the engine. I know from experience, I put one in backwards once and it left a puddle under the engine once it started, so it will leak if you put it in backwards. You push it in like that. The other half goes into the bearing cap. So we'll take this other half and we'll put it into the bearing cap. Now here's an opportunity. When we put this bearing cap on here, there's an opportunity for oil to seep out through the seams between the two halves and to leak. So before we torque this cap on the final time, we'll also put some silicone between here and here. Just a little bit of silicone on either side to prevent oil from seeping through the seams there. And we've checked to make sure that we've got our surfaces clean so that our bearing clearances will be right. Now, we've already wiped the crankshaft down, but before you put it in, make sure and wipe the journals down. We've cleaned it and wiped them down with a lint-free towel to make sure they're clean. Got it so it sits down into those bearings, and it's important at this point that you don't rotate the crankshaft. It's tempting to, but don't turn it. And now we're going to plastic gauge the upper bearing caps. We're ready to install the bearing cap and the lower bearing, and so put this into here. And one thing I didn't mention earlier, but just make sure you don't put any kind of assembly lube on the back sides of the bearings as you put them in there. They should go in dry. The same is true of the bearings that we put into the block. No lubrication goes on the back side of the bearing. The lubrication went on the top side where the crankshaft sits. So we're not going to put any assembly lube on this at this point. And we're going to plastic gauge this bearing to see what the clearance is between the bearing and the journal. So tear a piece of this plastic gauge material off. Inside the paper you'll find a strip of plastic gauge, which is a little plastic strip. Looks a little bit like mint dental floss. And put that on the bearing journal. So we'll set that plastic gauge on the bearing journal. And we always start with the middle journal. As you tighten anything like this, you'll start in the center and work your way out. We made sure this is the cap that goes on the middle, and we also make sure that the arrow, there's an arrow over here on the corner, make sure that arrow points toward the front of the engine. I don't know if you can see that. There it is. So we've got the cap on the right way and in the right location. We torque the bolts down now to their specifications. Before you put these bolts in too, that you clean the threads and that you wipe the threads with an oily rag. Don't dip the threads in oil. That'll get too much oil on them and they can hydrolock in the bolt hole. But if you just wipe the threads in an oily rag, it'll ensure that as you torque them down with the torque wrench that you get the proper clamping force. And torque these bolts down usually in at least 2 steps. And in this case, the torque specification calls for 2 steps. It says to first torque it to 35 foot-pounds and then to turn it 90 degrees. So if your specification only had one number, say for example it calls 76 foot-pounds, start out by torquing it to 35 and then go back and torque them both to 76. Okay. And this is an opportunity for us to show you how to use the protractor also to measure the angle or the degrees. So we've got this protractor that snaps onto the torque wrench, kind of like an extension, and you put the socket on the end of it. Once you get that on the bolt, you loosen up this set screw and turn the needle. Let's see where we're at here. Turn the needle until it points at 0. Then tighten down that set screw. Now he's going to turn it. You'll see right over here 70, 80, and 90 degrees. And so he's going to, of course, adjust the torque on the torque wrench until it's high. You could use a breaker bar for this if you wanted to. We just need to turn it 90 degrees. So he's just going to set it high enough that it's not going to click. And then we'll go ahead and turn it 90 degrees. Okay. Now, don't use the torque wrench to loosen this. We'll use a breaker bar. But now let's take this cap back off and inspect the plastic gauge. What we're going to do is see how much that plastic strip was crushed, and depending on how much it was crushed, it'll show us what the bearing clearance is. So once we've got the cap off, we find that plastic gauge and see how much it was spread out, and then we bring over the paper that the plastic gauge came in, and this paper has a gauge on it. And if we look at it, it looks like it's about as wide as the strip that says 2/1000 of an inch. So that tells us that's roughly 2/1000 of an inch bearing clearance there. and we would compare that to our specifications, and if that is within specifications, we're good. And we'd repeat that process with each of the bearings. We don't assume just because one is in specifications the rest are. We'll do that again with each of them. And then once you get to the connection rod, you'll end up doing plastic gauge for each of the connection rod bearings as well, just to make sure that the bearing clearance is correct on everything. Once you're done with the plastic gauge, you can use your fingernail just to kind of carefully scrape that off, or the plastic gauge itself is actually oil soluble, so you don't need to take it off. It's really up to you. Once you've done the plastic gauge, apply some assembly lube to the bearing cap, then install it back onto the engine and torque it down for its final time. And once you've torqued that down, don't turn the crankshaft yet. Don't turn it until you've had a chance to plastic gauge all of the main bearings, otherwise you'll get oil onto the journal. Once you have torqued the main bearing caps down on the crankshaft and everything is assembled for its final time, just to make sure that things are put together correctly and they rotate correctly, you'll want to turn the crankshaft. If you can turn it with your fingers, everything's just fine. There's not a problem with this one. If it's stiffer than that, you'll want to take a torque wrench like this with a dial on it and rotate it and measure how much effort it takes to turn that crankshaft. See, on this one it only takes, looks like it's about 2 or 3 inch-pounds, and that's great. What you don't want is one that takes more than about 5 foot-pounds of force to turn it. If you have that problem, you should go back and try to figure out which bearing or bearing cap is causing the crankshaft to bind.